Yes, I was, because it seemed like she encouraged Caitlin to be Caitlin. Caitlin was playing free flowing, coming down, pulling up, shooting threes, shooting those logo threes, 30-footers that the fans love. Now, she didn't make all of them, but she made a good high percentage of them. And that style really brought in the fans, brought in the eyeballs, brought in the TV ratings, and they won. They turned around. They won 20 games that year, 27 games that year from winning 4 or 5 the previous year. So obviously that style could win in the WNBA.
For months, frustration surrounding Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark has been simmering beneath the surface. Then suddenly, a viral interview exploded across the basketball world when Mychal Thompson delivered one of the strongest public criticisms, yet of the way Stephanie White has handled Caitlin Clark. This wasn't a casual disagreement about strategy. This was a direct challenge to the entire direction of the Indiana Fever franchise. According to Mychal Thompson, the very qualities that transformed Caitlin Clark into the biggest attraction in women's basketball are being systematically removed from her game. The logo threes. The fast pace, the improvisation, the freedom, the creativity. The criticism cuts deeper because Caitlin Clark didn't arrive as an unfinished prospect searching for an identity. Caitlin Clark arrived as a phenomenon. She arrived after rewriting college basketball history at University of Iowa women's basketball program. She arrived with sold-out arenas, record television audiences, and a style that forced the entire sports world to pay attention. Now the central question hanging over Stephanie White and the Indiana Fever is simple. Why would a franchise draft a transformational superstar and then ask her to become something else? That question became the emotional core of Mychal Thompson's argument. His frustration wasn't simply about wins and losses. His frustration was about identity, about philosophy, about whether Stephanie White is coaching the roster she wishes she had rather than the generational star already standing in front of her. And if Mychal Thompson is right, then the conflict between Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark could become one of the defining stories of the WNBA season.
This Stephanie White thing was going to work because we know how it is in Indy. It's the good old boy system. Well, the good old boy system is getting exposed by every other WNBA team because Stephanie White has been running this same system since Vanderbilt. That's why the Vanderbilt stint is so important when you're talking about Stephanie White coaching career, because that's where everything was exposed at, and that is the same system she's been running this entire damn time.
The most damaging part of Mychal Thompson's criticism wasn't his frustration with losses. It was his suggestion that the problems surrounding Stephanie White are not new. According to the discussion, Stephanie White has been running variations of the same system throughout her coaching career. That immediately shifts the debate away from short-term struggles and toward a much larger question. Can Stephanie White actually maximize Caitlin Clark? Because when observers look back at the second half of Caitlin Clark's rookie season, they remember something very different. They remember pace. They remember freedom. They remember transition opportunities. They remember Caitlin Clark launching from distances that forced defenses into panic mode. Most importantly, they remember results. The Indiana Fever became relevant. National broadcasts exploded. Television audiences surged. Every road game suddenly felt like an event. The criticism aimed at Stephanie White centers around the belief that the franchise abandoned a formula that was already producing momentum. What makes the situation fascinating is that nobody is arguing Caitlin Clark should avoid structure completely. Instead, the argument is that the structure should be built around Caitlin Clark's strengths. That's what championship organizations have historically done with superstars. When Magic Johnson changed basketball, the system adapted. When Stephen Curry changed basketball, the system adapted. When Michael Jordan changed basketball, the system adapted. The superstar wasn't forced into someone else's vision. The vision evolved around the superstar. That's why Mychal Thompson's comments resonated so strongly. They touched on a fear many fans already had. The fear that Stephanie White is trying to fit Caitlin Clark into a traditional mold, instead of unleashing the unique player who transformed the sport. And if that perception continues to grow, every loss will intensify scrutiny on Stephanie White, and every offensive struggle will become another piece of evidence in the argument.
If not asked out, she needs to go to the coaches or the gym and say, listen, I can't play this style. This isn't my style. I have to be more of a free-flowing type of player. I got to just let my game go. I got to be more of an adventurous type of player, more aggressive. I can't be walking the ball to the floor. I got to play fast. So she needs to woman up and express that privately to the coaching staff or to somebody. Says, this isn't me. This isn't what made me Caitlin Clark. I've got to be more of a
The most revealing section of the interview wasn't about trades, it wasn't about attendance, it wasn't even about coaching, it was about confidence. Because beneath every tactical debate lies a psychological question. What happens when a superstar begins playing in a way that no longer feels natural? Mychal Thompson repeatedly compared Caitlin Clark to players whose greatness came from freedom and instinct. Players like Isaiah Thomas and Stephen Curry didn't become legends by suppressing their creativity. They became legends because coaches trusted their instincts. That's where the criticism of Stephanie White becomes especially sharp. The concern isn't merely that Caitlin Clark's numbers may decline. The concern is that the style itself could slowly change the way Caitlin Clark approaches the game. Basketball history is filled with examples of players who looked different once hesitation entered the equation. A split-second delay changes everything. A player who once attacked now pauses. A player who once created now reacts. A player who once dictated the game begins following it. That psychological transformation is exactly what critics fear when discussing Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark. The interview repeatedly returned to one phrase: "Let Caitlin be Caitlin." That phrase has become almost a rallying cry among supporters who believe the franchise is limiting its greatest asset. Meanwhile, defenders of Stephanie White would argue that every superstar must continue evolving. They would point to turnovers, defensive lapses, decision-making, areas where Caitlin Clark still has room to improve. And that's what makes this debate so compelling. Both sides acknowledge Caitlin Clark's extraordinary talent. The disagreement centers entirely on how that talent should be utilized.
If they want to get the most out of Caitlin's career, they have to. Stephanie White has to change her philosophy and and adopt the Pat Riley style. Open up the Showtime era. Get away from this Paul Westhead style where he wanted to walk the ball to the floor because he had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Magic Johnson says, "No, man, we got to run." And Stephanie White needs to recognize this. Hey, Caitlin Clark is at her best. Your team is at their best when Caitlin Clark's allowed to freelance and do what she did when she was at Iowa. It'll benefit everybody. Kelsey Mitchell.
This is where the conversation becomes much bigger than basketball, because Caitlin Clark isn't simply another player. She is an economic force. Every discussion about Stephanie White eventually circles back to business realities. Ticket sales, television ratings, merchandise, national visibility, corporate partnerships. The argument presented by Mychal Thompson is that maximizing Caitlin Clark isn't just the best basketball decision, it's the best business decision. If Stephanie White unlocks the most explosive version of Caitlin Clark, the entire roster benefits. Transition opportunities increase, spacing improves, defenders become stretched, teammates receive easier looks. The offense becomes harder to predict. But if the current tension continues, critics fear a far more dangerous outcome. A growing divide between organizational philosophy and superstar identity. The interview even ventured into discussions about trade demands and future destinations. Those ideas remain speculative, but the fact they're being discussed at all reveals how intense the frustration has become. Because championship organizations cannot afford prolonged uncertainty between a franchise cornerstone and the system surrounding her. Every game now becomes a referendum on Stephanie White. Every offensive performance becomes evidence for one side of the debate. Every loss strengthens critics. Every win strengthens supporters. And sitting at the center of it all is Caitlin Clark, carrying expectations unlike almost any player in recent WNBA history.